Spring 1945, southern Germany. Rainwater dripped from the shattered roof of a railway station somewhere outside Munich. The war was ending, but Germany did not yet know how to live without it. Smoke still hung over the nearby town where American artillery had passed only hours earlier. Burned vehicles lined the road like blackened skeletons. Under the station awning, several German nurses sat silently beside stacks of medical bags and torn Red Cross armbands. Most were barely in their 20s. For years they had heard the same warnings from Nazi officials and retreating officers. If the Americans captured them, humiliation would follow. Some believed they would be beaten, others feared they would simply disappear. Then an American guard approached through the cold morning rain. The women stiffened instantly, but instead of shouting, the soldier removed a field blanket from his jeep and quietly handed it to the nearest nurse whose hands were trembling from the cold. No one spoke. For a moment, even the rain seemed distant, and across collapsing Germany, thousands of exhausted women were beginning to realize that the enemy they had feared for years did not look the way they had imagined. Germany in collapse. By the autumn of 1944, the Third Reich was already bleeding to death. In the West, Allied bombers crossed German skies almost daily. Cities that had once symbolized industrial power now burned through the night. Cologne, Hamburg, Frankfurt, and Dresden became landscapes of shattered stone and twisted steel. Railway lines vanished under explosions. Hospitals overflowed faster than doctors could clear beds. Entire districts disappeared beneath smoke before rescue crews could even arrive. At the same time, Germany's military situation was collapsing on every front. After the Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944, American, British, and Canadian forces pushed steadily eastward through France and Belgium. The Wehrmacht no longer fought with confidence. It fought to delay the inevitable. Inside field hospitals, German nurses watched the change happen day by day. Many belonged to the German Red Cross or military auxiliary medical services attached to the Wehrmacht. Some had volunteered out of patriotism early in the war. Others had been assigned as casualties mounted beyond Germany's shrinking manpower. They worked in overcrowded wards where wounded soldiers arrived faster than morphine supplies. Amputations were performed beside candlelight when electricity failed. Trains carrying casualties often arrived already filled with dead men, frozen during transport. Most nurses had little political influence. Their world was practical and immediate: bandages, infections, blood loss, exhaustion. Yet they lived inside a system saturated with propaganda. Since the beginning of the war, Nazi newspapers, radio broadcasts, and military briefings had warned constantly about Germany's enemies. Soviet troops were portrayed as destroyers from the east. Americans were described as brutal occupiers hiding behind wealth and machines. Surrender itself was treated almost as betrayal. As Allied forces approached Germany's borders, fear spread through hospitals and refugee convoys faster than official orders. Stories circulated endlessly, some real, many exaggerated, others entirely invented. Nurses whispered about what might happen if they were captured. Young women burned letters and photographs before evacuations. Some removed military insignia from their uniforms in secret, hoping it might protect them later. But the front kept moving closer, and by early 1945, the sound of American artillery could already be heard deep inside Western Germany. France civilians, the Rhine had long carried symbolic meaning, a natural shield protecting the heart of the country. Once Allied troops crossed it, many understood that the Reich could no longer survive. Columns of U.S. armored vehicles rolled through ruined towns beneath low spring clouds. Sherman tanks pushed along roads crowded with refugees, retreating soldiers, horse carts, and abandoned equipment. Bridges collapsed behind withdrawing German units while military police struggled to control panic spreading through civilian populations. The German medical system was already near total breakdown. Field hospitals relocated constantly to avoid capture. Surgical teams operated inside schools, churches, wine cellars, and railway tunnels. Supplies disappeared faster than replacements could arrive. Penicillin had become desperately scarce inside Germany, while American forces carried it in growing quantities. Many wounded German soldiers understood the contrast immediately when they fell into Allied custody. For nurses, the situation became increasingly chaotic. Some were ordered to evacuate with retreating units toward Bavaria and Austria. Others remained behind with patients too weak to move. In certain hospitals, doctors simply surrendered entire medical facilities once American troops appeared outside the town. Resistance often lasted only hours before white flags emerged from shattered windows. Yet fear still dominated nearly every conversation. Rumors about captivity followed refugee columns moving westward. Many Germans, soldiers and civilians alike, deliberately tried to avoid Soviet forces advancing from the east. Trains became packed with women, children, and medical staff attempting to reach areas expected to fall under American control instead. To many Germans, surrendering to the Western Allies appeared to offer at least a possibility of survival. The U.S. Army, meanwhile, had already established procedures for handling prisoners of war and medical personnel. Under the Geneva Convention, captured nurses and doctors were not treated the same way as ordinary combat troops. American guards received instructions regarding searches, transport, food distribution, and medical processing. Discipline varied between units, especially after years of brutal combat, but official policy emphasized control rather than revenge. Still, policy on paper meant little to frightened women who had spent years hearing entirely different promises from Nazi authorities. So when American soldiers finally entered German hospitals and temporary aid stations in the spring of 1945, many nurses prepared themselves for the worst. What happened next became one of the strangest emotional shocks of the war's final weeks. For many German nurses, captivity began long before surrender. It began with years of fear carefully built through speeches, newspapers, radio broadcasts, and military indoctrination. Since the early days of the war, Nazi propaganda had portrayed Germany as a nation surrounded by enemies who sought not only victory but destruction. The message became even harsher as defeat approached. Officials warned civilians that Allied troops would bring chaos, revenge, and humiliation to German soil. Inside hospitals, these stories spread constantly. Nurses heard wounded soldiers describe terrifying retreats from both east and west. Some accounts were true. Others became distorted through exhaustion and panic. But by 1945, fear no longer depended on evidence. It had become part of daily life. Young women working 12-hour shifts beside dying soldiers often imagined captivity as something worse than death itself. Some hid cyanide capsules among medical supplies. Others discussed escape routes toward the Alps, where rumors claimed German forces would continue resistance from mountain fortresses. Many simply waited in silence, uncertain whether to flee or remain with their patients. Then American troops arrived. Again and again, the same moment repeated itself across Western Germany. Nervous nurses stood beside hospital entrances, expecting screaming guards or violent searches. Instead, they often encountered tired American infantrymen more concerned with securing roads, collecting weapons, and organizing medical care than punishing exhausted hospital staff. The psychological shock was immediate. Not because the Americans appeared friendly. Most looked hardened by war, covered in mud after months of combat through France and Germany. But many behaved with restraint that contradicted everything the nurses had been told to expect. For women who had lived under total war propaganda for years, even ordinary behavior suddenly felt extraordinary. American soldiers entering Germany in 1945 carried their own anger into the war's final months. Many had fought since Normandy. Some had survived the Battle of the Bulge during one of the coldest winters in Europe in decades. Others had seen concentration camps only days earlier. Combat exhaustion ran deep through Allied units pushing toward the center of Germany. Yet discipline remained a critical part of U.S. military operations. American commanders understood that the occupation of Germany would shape the post-war world. Soldiers received instructions regarding treatment of prisoners, civilians, and medical personnel. Guards assigned to processing centers were expected to follow military regulations closely, especially when handling women attached to hospitals or Red Cross services. This did not mean kindness was universal. Some American troops viewed all Germans with suspicion or resentment. Others had lost friends in brutal fighting only weeks before. Tension inside temporary prisoner camps could rise quickly, especially when large groups surrendered at once. But compared to the terror many German nurses expected, the reality often appeared startlingly controlled. Weapons were confiscated, names were recorded, medical inspections followed. Food worked alongside captured German nurses to continue treating wounded patients who remained inside overcrowded hospitals. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Women who had expected immediate violence instead found themselves standing in orderly lines for soup or cigarettes distributed by guards barely older than themselves. Some nurses later recalled being shocked not by dramatic acts of compassion, but by small details, being addressed politely, being allowed to keep personal photographs, or hearing American soldiers lower their voices around wounded civilians. The war had taught both sides to imagine monsters, but exhaustion was beginning to strip those illusions away. By April 1945, roads across central Germany had become rivers of movement. Civilians pulled carts through the mud beside collapsing military columns. Elderly men limped past burned vehicles carrying children wrapped in blankets. Nurses rode in overcrowded ambulances packed with wounded soldiers whose uniforms no longer matched organized units. Everywhere, the same question followed the retreat westward. Who would reach them first? For millions of Germans, the answer mattered deeply. The Red Army advancing from the east carried enormous momentum after years of devastating warfare across the Soviet Union. German civilians had heard stories of revenge, looting, and mass violence spreading ahead of Soviet advances into East Prussia and Silesia. Some reports were exaggerated by propaganda, others were horrifyingly real. As a result, countless refugees attempted to move toward American or British lines instead. German nurses often found themselves trapped inside this desperate migration. Hospital administrators redirected convoys away from eastern sectors whenever possible. Medical trains changed routes repeatedly as Soviet forces moved closer. In overcrowded shelters, women whispered constantly about where American units had last been seen. The irony was impossible to escape. For years, Nazi propaganda had described the Western Allies as ruthless enemies, determined to destroy Germany. Yet, in the final weeks of the war, many Germans risked everything to surrender specifically to them. American troops noticed it immediately. Entire groups of soldiers emerged from forests carrying white cloths tied to rifles. Civilians approached checkpoints, begging for protection. Nurses arrived beside horse carts carrying wounded men wrapped in blood-stained blankets, asking only whether the Americans would permit treatment to continue. And slowly, word began spreading among refugees. The Americans were searching prisoners, organizing camps, distributing rations, and enforcing strict control. But they were not behaving like the nightmare many had expected. That realization traveled through Germany almost as quickly as the collapse itself. The final months of World War II produced destruction on a scale difficult to comprehend. Cities disappeared beneath bombing campaigns. Entire armies collapsed. Millions became prisoners, refugees, or casualties in a matter of weeks. Yet many memories preserved by German nurses after the war were not memories of grand events. They were memories of brief human moments that interrupted fear. A cup of coffee handed across a checkpoint. A wounded American soldier thanking a German nurse after treatment. A guard sharing cigarettes with exhausted medical staff during a freezing night outside a temporary processing center. In some captured hospitals, American medics chose not to dismiss German nurses immediately because there were simply too many wounded patients to abandon. Enemies worked side by side beneath damaged ceilings, while artillery still echoed in the distance. Language barriers forced communication through gestures and improvised phrases. The work itself became the common language, stopping bleeding, carrying stretchers, changing dressings. These encounters did not erase hatred or grief. Many American soldiers still carried deep anger toward Germany after years of war. German nurses remained uncertain about what future awaited them under occupation. Some interactions were cold, others tense. There were incidents of theft, harassment, and harsh treatment in certain areas, particularly amid the confusion of mass surrender. But the broader reality remained strikingly different from the apocalyptic warnings repeated during the Nazi years. For some nurses, the emotional shock came only after several days in captivity. The violence they had prepared themselves for never arrived. Instead came paperwork, guarded transport trucks, medical inspections, and long periods of waiting inside crowded camps, where the war slowly faded into silence. And as April turned into May 1945, another realization became unavoidable. Germany was not merely losing the war anymore. The Third Reich itself was disappearing. April-May 1945. In the final weeks of the war, Germany no longer resembled a functioning nation. Entire military commands dissolved, while orders contradicted each other across collapsing communication lines. Railway stations overflowed with wounded soldiers abandoned during evacuation. Smoke drifted over cities where government offices no longer operated. Along shattered roads leading south toward Bavaria, columns of refugees moved beside retreating Wehrmacht units that had almost no fuel left to continue fighting. Then came April 1945. American armies pushed rapidly through central and southern Germany with overwhelming speed. The U.S. 7th Army advanced into Bavaria, while other Allied formations surrounded industrial regions farther north. Town after town surrendered after brief resistance or none at all. White sheets appeared from apartment windows before tanks even entered some streets. For German nurses, the collapse unfolded in deeply personal ways. Hospitals lost contact with military headquarters. Doctors destroyed records before abandoning buildings. Some nurses continued treating wounded men without knowing whether the German government still existed. Others watched teenage soldiers arrive from shattered frontline units carrying injuries so severe they could barely speak. Outside many hospitals, chaos intensified. SS units occasionally attempted to continue resistance even when local commanders wanted surrender. Civilians feared both combat and starvation as food systems collapsed. Rumors spread hourly. Hitler had fled Berlin. Hitler was preparing a final counterattack. Berlin had already fallen. Nobody knew what to believe anymore. Then the reality became impossible to deny. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide inside his bunker in Berlin as Soviet forces closed around the city. News traveled unevenly across Germany, but when confirmation arrived, the psychological foundation of the regime collapsed almost overnight. Officers burned insignia. Local Nazi officials disappeared. Soldiers removed armbands and medals before surrendering. For many nurses, that moment carried less triumph than exhaustion. Years of sacrifice, fear, propaganda, and loss suddenly ended, not with victory or heroic final stands, but with silence. The authority that had governed every part of wartime life simply vanished beneath advancing Allied armies. At the same time, American troops entering deeper into Germany encountered scenes that hardened their emotions even further. In several areas, U.S. soldiers discovered concentration camps and forced labor, sites filled with starving prisoners and mass graves. The shock spread rapidly through Allied units. Many soldiers who had previously viewed the war only through combat now saw evidence of atrocities committed behind German lines. German nurses often sensed the atmosphere change immediately. American guards became colder. Interrogations grew sharper. Some prisoners feared that the discoveries inside the camps would trigger revenge against all Germans regardless of individual responsibility. Yet even amid that tension, the machinery of surrender continued. Weapons were collected. Hospitals were secured. Prisoners were processed in growing numbers as the last fragments of Nazi Germany collapsed around them. And within days, the war in Europe would officially end. The surrender becomes real. After Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, the sound of war did not disappear immediately. Gunfire still echoed in isolated areas where confused units had not yet received orders. Smoke continued rising from destroyed rail yards and fuel depots. Roads remained crowded, with displaced civilians searching for relatives, food, or shelter. But for millions across Europe, the structure of the war had finally broken apart. For captured German nurses, this was the moment when fear collided fully with reality. Across southern and western Germany, American forces established temporary processing centers inside schools, warehouses, former military barracks, and open transit camps. Surrounded by barbed wire, trucks carrying prisoners arrived constantly. Wehrmacht soldiers stood in long, exhausted lines beside civilian auxiliaries, clerks, drivers, and medical personnel. Many nurses entered these camps expecting the worst until the very last moment. Some later described watching American guards carefully for signs of violence as they stepped down from transport vehicles. Others remembered hiding personal belongings beneath clothing because they feared robbery or humiliation. A few had spent so long listening to wartime propaganda that even ordinary instructions shouted in English sounded threatening at first. Instead, the process usually followed military routine. Names were recorded. Medical staff were separated from regular combat prisoners in some sectors. Wounded personnel received treatment regardless of nationality when facilities were available. Nurses often underwent health inspections before being assigned temporary quarters inside crowded camps or requisitioned buildings. Food became one of the strongest symbols of psychological change. Germany's supply system had nearly collapsed by the end of the war. Many nurses arrived after weeks of near starvation while working in evacuation hospitals filled with wounded men. Inside American-controlled areas, rations were limited and conditions remained difficult, but organized distribution itself felt unfamiliar after the chaos of the final months. Again and again, survivors later remembered small details. Hot coffee served from field kitchens, American guards allowing exhausted women to rest before questioning, blankets distributed during cold nights, cigarettes exchanged through fences between former enemies only days after combat had ended. None of this erased the reality of defeat. Germany lay in ruins. Millions were dead, and cities had vanished beneath bombing and artillery fire. Captivity still meant uncertainty, interrogation, and the humiliation of total surrender. Some American soldiers remained openly hostile toward Germans, especially after learning of concentration camp atrocities. But for many nurses, the emotional shock came from realizing that the image they had carried for years no longer matched the men standing in front of them. The feared conquerors often appeared tired rather than cruel, young rather than monstrous, strict, armed, and watchful, yet still operating within rules that many prisoners had not expected to survive long enough to witness. And inside those overcrowded camps, beneath floodlights and spring rain, the psychological war created by years of propaganda finally began to collapse, returning to a defeated country. By the summer of 1945, the uniforms no longer carried the same meaning. German nurses who had spent years inside military hospitals now found themselves moving through a country that barely functioned. Some were released from temporary American custody within weeks because medical workers were urgently needed among the civilian population. Others remained in internment centers longer, while occupation authorities reviewed records and affiliations connected to the Nazi state. When they finally returned home, many discovered there was little home left to return to. Entire neighborhoods had disappeared beneath Allied bombing campaigns. Railway stations stood roofless and silent. Families were scattered across occupation zones, divided between American, British, French, and Soviet control. In some cities, women searched for relatives by walking from one refugee registration board to another, carrying faded photographs inside coat pockets. Food shortages shaped daily life everywhere. Former nurses who had once organized military wards now waited in ration lines beside civilians surviving on black market potatoes and watered soup. Hospitals lacked medicine, clean linens, and functioning equipment. Tuberculosis and infection spread rapidly through overcrowded shelters filled with displaced people. Germany's defeat was no longer measured only in destroyed armies. It appeared in exhausted faces standing among ruins. The occupation authorities also began the long process of denazification. Questionnaires were distributed across American-controlled sectors asking about political membership, wartime service, and organizational involvement. For many nurses, the process felt deeply uncomfortable. Some had joined Nazi-affiliated organizations automatically through wartime service structures. Others insisted they had focused only on medical duties while avoiding politics entirely. the truth was often complicated. Many German nurses had not been ideological fanatics, yet they had still lived and worked inside a system responsible for catastrophic destruction across Europe. After the war, some struggled with guilt. Others focused entirely on survival, pushing memories aside in order to rebuild ordinary lives. And silence settled over many of their experiences. In post-war Germany, people rarely spoke openly about surrender during the first years after the collapse. Defeat carried humiliation. Captivity carried shame. Women who had feared American soldiers often found it difficult to explain later how surprising those encounters had been, especially while the nation struggled to confront the far larger horrors uncovered after the fall of the Third Reich. But those memories did not disappear. They remained quietly stored beneath the rubble of post-war Germany, waiting for later generations to ask what the final days of the war had truly felt like from the inside. The memory that remained. As the years passed, Germany slowly rebuilt itself from ruins that had once seemed permanent. Railways reopened. Factories returned to operation. Children grew up among streets where bomb craters were gradually replaced by new apartment blocks and storefronts. In the Eastern occupation zone, American forces shifted from conquerors to long-term allies as tensions with the Soviet Union hardened into the Cold War. And quietly, memories of surrender began to change. For many former German nurses, the image of American soldiers remained tied not to battlefield combat, but to the strange emotional disorientation of 1945, the moment when years of fear collided with unexpectedly controlled behavior inside prisoner camps and occupied hospitals. Historians later found similar recollections repeated across testimonies and memoirs from Western Germany. Women remembered being shocked by ordinary gestures that wartime propaganda had taught them to believe were impossible. Some recalled guards sharing food during transport. Others described American medics treating German wounded without distinction. A few admitted they had spent days waiting for violence that never came. These memories did not erase the suffering caused by the war itself. Germany's occupation still brought hardship, interrogations, shortages, and deep uncertainty about the future. American soldiers were not universally compassionate, and relationships between occupiers and civilians could become tense or exploitative in certain areas. But compared with the terror many nurses had expected during the final months of the Reich, the reality of American custody often appeared profoundly different. That contrast carried political consequences after the war.